My name is Andrew Stewart, and I am a member of the Rhode Island Media Cooperative. 2016 has proven to be one of the most eventful years in recent memory. One element that is particularly taking up a substantial level of interest is the issue of minority rights. In a year where groups like Black Lives Matter have been making headlines on a weekly basis, it seems that a great level of political activity and attention is being paid black and brown people and their votes during this election. In order to better understand this group, I have spent the past year talking with voters across America, asking them about both the election and what they hope to hear talked about the day after they cast their ballot. We now present to you the results of those conversations. Imam Farid Ansari is the Imam of the Muslim American Dawah Center and is an African American Muslim. So, election cycle and what it has brought up for the Muslim community in Rhode Island.
Well, I think, it sort of prioritizes our concerns, regarding, because of the atmosphere, the anti-Islamic atmosphere, the anti-Muslim atmosphere that's been created as a result of this current election cycle, particularly when it comes down to, I consider it a threat of Donald Trump's being elected to the presidency. I mean, it's something so threatening to the Muslim community as far as the perception that he's created this anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim rhetoric. So obviously, it's something that we are very much concerned about.
What are some of the issues that you have faced in the last year as an imam, both in terms of the non-Muslim community, but also just things your congregants and members of your community have been facing and dealing with?
Well, it's sort of like sort of a two-edged sword. On one hand, we have been the interfaith community has been very receptive, very supportive, because of the anti-Islamic sentiment that's being sort of spawned as a result of the Republican convention, a possibility of having Donald Trump elected and to the presidency, and it's very, very threatening, and clearly it's something that's being looked upon very seriously. But we've been here in Rhode Island been very fortunate because of the activities that we've been engaged in the past concerning the interfaith relations that we've had. So we've been on one hand, it's been favorable, but on the other hand, it has also created a lot of it's changed. Things are changing. I mean, particularly when they had the primary here, there was a lot of sentiment towards the Republicans, the Republican agenda, which is again something that I was frankly quite surprised to see here in Rhode Island. So that's something that we've been dealing with, and it's something that I'm concerned about, and it's something that has been addressed. You must have heard about the incident that occurred out in South County at the mosque, where the mosque had been defaced, and a lot of obscenities and basically a hate crime that was perpetrated there. So that's the kind of thing that's been, sort of, it's happened. A lot of anti-Islamic sentiment here in Rhode Island that has manifested itself. There, a year ago at the school. So these are things that we've been dealing with as far as this Muslim community.
It's interesting you mentioned the results of the primary because it was a very overwhelming victory for both Bernie Sanders in terms of him in that primary, but also the results with voters who voted Democrat instead of Republican. It was a very extreme gap.
Yes, yes, and I was surprised, quite frankly. But then again, you never. It sort of was a sort of a litmus test is what's happening nationally, and I'm personally very, it's a concern. I mean, I think rightfully so. It's Islamophobia. This here kind of, I think you talk about radicalization Islamically, but there's a lot of radicalization and politically, you know.
Right. The point that has struck me this year is that this has been a sort of populist upsurge against what has been called for a long time consensus politics, and that was seen in both Trump and Sanders. And of course, that always has entailed, in one sense or another, hatred of certain group, whether it's religious, ethnic, or other identity element. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of perspective?
Yeah, well, I'm always concerned about these type of, well, when I think about historically, what led to the Civil War, what created this the divided divided the country and literally resulted in a civil war, which was harmful and dangerous and bad enough, but to have this kind of atmosphere of red states and blue states, things are just not that way. I mean, we shouldn't, we hopefully we can live up to the American ideals that are there that we, e pluribus unum, you know what I mean, out of one many. Our country is very diverse, and I mean, we should be evolving towards that, not get digressing back into sort of the darkness and the dark ages of segregation, of racial segregation, of religious bigotry, and so on and so forth. I would hope that as Americans we can, evolve to the kind of values that were promulgated early on, with the founding fathers that are there in the Constitution. I mean, much of what Donald Trump is saying and promoting is unconstitutional. Number one, I mean, it's just it's unconscionable as well. To even hear a person who is running for public office to be in this kind of rhetoric even being acceptable. It should be something that should be that should be throwing up a lot of red flags for most Americans. I mean, just even as Americans, that attitude, that's being fermented, going back to the communist rhetoric, the kinds of kind of talk that led to the surveillance of Americans under the counterintelligence program and that kind of stuff. My hope as an African American and as an African American Muslim is that we would, evolve to live up to the ideals that as Americans that we promulgate, that's promulgated in our Constitution. This, these guarantees, these freedoms that we talk so much about. But when it comes down to when it's challenged, we want to regress into a whole nother, I can't even describe the kind of, sort of tyrannical and authoritarian, totalitarian kind of rhetoric and attitudes towards others, albeit, black or Japanese, I mean, when we went to war with Japan, a lot of the, rhetoric that came out of that to demonize the whole people, which led up to the internment of Japanese. And, just the other day, yesterday we celebrated the victory over Japan Day here in Rhode Island. And, I think we're the only state in the United States that still maintains that type of sentiment towards Japanese Americans. I mean, I think it's time to rethink a lot of that, that kind of feeling that promotes the kind of mindset that would still celebrate the victory over Japan. When you think about what happened in Nagasaki and and dropping the atomic bomb on Japan, I mean that doesn't necessarily resonate with my with me personally, where I would think that when I look at Japanese people, are we still looking at them, and although I'm sure, I don't know if Donald Trump would think that this is politically correct to be calling Japanese Americans Japs. I mean, because it's a very derogatory term that was adopted during that time. But we don't want to. I would hope that we don't go back to that. But it's there.
Right. The last time, in my sense of this, that we had a real populist upsurge that seemed to be challenging the margins of the political discourse was the 60s and the period that actually gave birth to the growth of the African American Muslim population. And one of our friends, Richard Loban, has actually said to me on one occasion that he's getting reminded of 1968 quite often due to the events going on in the news. I wonder what you think in those terms.
Well, yeah. I mean, look at the resurgence. Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's still he has to have to make that a public or movement to indicate that, yeah, I mean, don't all lives matter? But why is it that the emphasis has to be placed upon Black life simply because blacks are being still victimized by a lot of police brutality and bad apples within the law enforcement community? Although it's the ordinary police officer on the street, not to mention a lot of the surveillance and kind of things that were going on in the 60s, which of course I personally think that maybe that a lot of that stuff is still happening, particularly with the Muslim community, similar to when the 60s, when that type of permission was sort of given because the black experience, it was, this terminology represented a clear and present danger, which seems to be, that was the language of the day then. Now there's a whole different, coded language that permits them, meaning law enforcement, to go ahead and, extrajudicial kinds of, behavior that's sort of sanctioned, whether or not lawfully or unlawfully, because under the Patriot Act, that brought us back to a period in time that, permits this kind of activity to take place. Because if you're labeled as anywhere, like as far as Muslims are concerned, once you're labeled as terrorists or supporter of terrorists, and Islam is being demonized to that degree that, there's something as simple as sending in a charitable donation to a group that is on their list of terrorist organizations or whatever, then you're targeted, as innocent as it may be. So yeah, a lot of that stuff is happening that is reminiscent of that period in time. And that is a concern. That is a big concern. It's a concern of mine. And I'm sure that people who lived during that experience would see a lot of the same signals that are sort of creating that type of, atmosphere, at least. And, Donald Trump seems to think that, he doesn't have to be politically correct. He doesn't have to be correct at all, as far as I'm concerned, because when anyone, can utter some of these sentiments promoting violence, and encouraging, civil unrest. I mean, really, that's irresponsible. I really, you know, would I hope and pray to God that this man does not get elected as the president, because that would take us back to a time that I feel would create another, situation here in America that would lead to a lot more civil unrest as it did in the 60s.
Right. So, having touched on earlier the element of the Red Scare that seems to be recurring again towards Muslims, I wanted to talk about maybe trying to briefly uh, articulate a way to deflate that sort of paranoia, because a lot of it comes from a place of ignorance and misunderstanding. For example, in the period of the Red Scare, the accusation was that communists were getting orders from Moscow and they were double agents. And now that has shifted to Islamic countries, be it Saudi Arabia, Iran, wherever. And the motif would be in the discourse that Muslims are taking orders from these different countries, when in fact they might just be reading religious teachings by imams or scholars that live in different countries. Are you seeing anything like that coming around?
I I I haven't directly, but indirectly, is in terms of when I see behaviors that are totally Islamic, and I see that there are elements that are within allegedly within the Islamic community that are being and use once again using the code word being radicalized by these people who are fermenting this kind of or being this type of radicalization, and yeah, I'm sure there are, because we're witnessing some behaviors that are being attributed to the Muslim community. However, if people within the Muslim community are doing and behaving in a way that is anti-Islamic, then it has to be condemned for what it is. I mean, this notion of the radicalization, of Muslims, oftentimes when I hear this kind of rhetoric, I don't know if you read the book The Devil's Game, which talks about for over maybe 6 or 7 decades, going back to colonialism and the strategy that was used to divide and conquer, Islamic countries and so-called Islamic countries, I should say, or to more or less utilize groups that within these countries to like you mentioned the communism. Well, these groups were used to against the communist influence within these countries, like in Syria, like in Lebanon, and other countries that were that the United States was combating. Not the United States, England, France, and others that were trying to prevent the spread of communism. Well, they were supporting some of these so-called they were these marginal Muslims were being used by the Western powers, the United States, England, France, in order to divide or to fight against communism. So they created their own kind of, the Al Qaeda. I mean, it's no secret that Al Qaeda was initially, organized to fight against the Russians by the United States, the CIA. I mean, that's all documented. It's nothing, there's no secret. But this goes back even way beyond that period in time. I mean, this has been a strategy to divide and conquer, countries, so-called Islamic countries, going back to the Ottoman Empire, and things that led even to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So this has been happening within the Islamic community. There have been elements within the Islamic experience or the Islamic community that goes back centuries that the West has been involved in trying to ferment dissension, and they've led to these radical groups themselves. Their hands are not clean, so to speak, in terms of this radical element. That what now we're seeing another, sort of a hybrid kind of radicalized imams who are, being used as well, both for or against, if it's in favor of the interests of it could be England or France or the United States, then they support them. If it's unfavorable, then they try to, have someone else, they can get rid of them themselves, or they'll have some proxies fighting among themselves. But whoever is supporting the interests of some of these Western countries, then they'll finance them. They'll give them weapons and so on and so forth. So, we gotta see things for what they are. And as far as Islam is concerned, the Islamic values have been undermined within and from without. So it's a very challenging time for most Muslims, and I don't think most Muslims are even aware of a lot of the other intrigues that are occurring even within the greater global picture, so to speak. Because I mean, you like you said, you mentioned the fight against communism. Was part of the fight against communism was supporting some of these Islamic groups, and I think this ISIS and these other people, they don't represent the true Islamic core interests. If anything, they seem to be fighting against Islam. And with the recent attack in Medina, one of the most sacred cities in Islam, you can't tell me that these people who claim to be trying to establish a caliphate are honestly Muslims or represent Islamic interests. To me, they don't, obviously, because their behavior defies everything that Muslims stand for. That's why all the confusion. Many people, I would dare say that even Muslims are confused with ISIS because they're sending mixed signals. Because on one hand, you're reading the Quran, you should know the Quran, and then you see when this is opposing what they're doing in terms of, they're creating more harm than good. When Islam says, promoting the good and forbidding the evil, that's part of, that's almost an axiom within Islam, to promote good and forbid the evil. But seemingly they're promoting evil and forbidding the good. Quite to the contrary.
So one of the things that happened this year that has quite impressed me was the fact that American foreign policy was put into sort of interrogation that it hasn't been put into for a very long time. And in particularly, you saw Bernie Sanders refuse to go to APAC and instead give an address where he really took the bull by the horns and spoke out in defense of the Palestinian cause, regardless of whatever flaws it had. That is something you would not have seen 4 years ago or 8 years ago from a Democratic candidate. And it was somewhat striking to some commentators, because Hillary Clinton ended up trying to go to AIPAC and out hawk a man who had lived in Israel on a kibbutz. So
Hmm.
I wonder what you would like to see if you think a window is opened up from there, because we're talking about blowback in foreign policy. Uh,
Hmm.
what you would like to see in terms of either legislation or civic dialogue coming about in our discourse towards the international scene and foreign policy,
Well, as it relates to Palestine
or to Islamic matters in
and the
general.
Palestinians,
The Palestinians, but also Islamic members, countries in general.
well, I, I, I think that the American interest is going to be what is going to be the dominant, motivation. If it promotes the interests of the United States, then they will. I think their foreign policy will always align, be aligned with that the interests of the United States. I mean, I think that to some extent it makes sense, because but we have to be just and we should be equitable, and all, and if we are going to take the higher road as the United States. The United States is in a unique position. I mean, I think we'll probably be damned if we do and damned if we don't. But whatever's, we should follow the best course of action. And that's very difficult, particularly in the world that we're living in. But we have to stick to our guns and stick to our, I mean, just that's figuratively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, in terms of principles and values, that we as a country, we as a try to promote. If we expect to have the kind of, or envision the kind of world that we wish to establish, and we always talk about freedom, and the freedoms in terms of our conception of freedom as Americans, and liberty, and all of these other values that we hold so dear. That if we expect to have those established universally, then we have to live up. We have to be examples of that. And I don't. We have a foreign policy. Particularly when it comes down to the use of drones and other kinds of. I really can't. I don't endorse that type of. That type of unilateral, extrajudicial kinds of things that we as a country are involved in terms of foreign policy. That's part of it. Now, when it comes down to the Palestinian situation, I've been to Israel, and I think that what is going over there is so unfair, so unjust to establishment of the kibbutz and all of these other, literally taking over, Palestinian lands and these settlements of Jews. And, I'm sure that many Jewish people are, particularly Jewish Americans, are not they sort of support that unilaterally. Whatever Israel does, Israel can't do any harm, can't do any evil. I've been there, and I see that as being that wall that they built. When you think back in terms of what the Nazis did to Jewish people, I mean, what's up with that wall? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been there to Israel to see that, but it's such a oppressive regime that is being established by the Israeli government, and it's just terrible as far as I'm concerned. So whatever we can do as an influence that the United States can do to alleviate that type of conduct, I mean, we give Israel millions and millions of dollars, because there's certain relationship that the United States has with Israel that to me, and then we don't have any control over things that they do. They seem to, defy even. I mean, look at when Netanyahu came to address Congress. You would have thought that he was treated like the president of the United States, and the president didn't even attend that joint session of Congress, to my knowledge. I mean, so once again, I'm not, and I suppose I'm not favoring. I don't favor a lot of the present policy. I applaud Bernie Sanders' effort to try to present an alternative, but obviously that alternative is perhaps what may have led to his not winning the Democratic nomination.
Right.
So I don't think we're ready for the likes of Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. We're not ready for that as a country, unfortunately.
Yeah. So moving to the other direction, what would you, as an African American, like to see talked about, worked on, or developed in Rhode Island and the wider country?
In Rhode Island, I mean, the same, Rhode Island is a microcosm of what's happening in America in general. I think, we have to really, really begin to deal with the remnants and the vestiges of slavery, racism, which is alive and not well, here in America. And the fact that America was founded on this notion of white supremacy, which still pervades the consciousness, whether or not it's been forbidden. Slavery obviously has, thank God. But the Jim Crow laws that are still there, that have been established under that type of the inequalities that still exist in terms of opportunities. So there's a lot that has to really be dealt with to hopefully get rid of that type of cancerous mentality that seems to linger on until there's some real. You talk about affirmative action. That language that came out of the Brown decision, and that was an effort to take some so-called affirmative action. But here we are, over 50 years later, and there's still a lot of the same problems, going on that is going to has ruined this country in terms of its social relationships between the races, and racism in general is just a sickness that it has to be cured. It has to be, otherwise it's going to destroy us. It's going to destroy us as a country. Going back to the time when the very establishment of the United States, which was established on, the subjugation of blacks, and that mentality still, whether or not people can recognize it in its different forms, it's still there. Then America, I would hope that, I don't know if it happened in my lifetime. I mean, when I see the likes of Donald Trump and that mentality, it only, it seems to be a resurgence. I had an opportunity to, travel down in the South, not too long ago, and they're still flying, the Confederate flag. You would have thought that, that type of sentiment would have been abolished. If someone tries to raise the Vietnamese flag or the Japanese flag or any other flag in America that we fought against and Americans died over, you would think that there wouldn't be that type of sentiment would not be allowed, or that type of because what it does is just divides us more and more. But there's always going to apparently there's always, here we are 2016 and there are those vestiges of pockets of racism. I think the Southern Poverty Law Institute monitors all of these groups that they're there, they're there still promulgating hatred and animosity towards different races and different religions. And Donald Trump doesn't help. He's not helping. He's just letting his campaign ride that wave, riding the wave of hatred and animosity, racial. Although he uses these coded words, but the sentiment that he creates against Mexicans, and he has no problem speaking out and creating this bias and prejudice against Muslims, against Mexicans, against women, and those who are physically and I guarantee you one thing: if he said something against the gay community, he would be done tomorrow. Or if he said something against the Jewish community, because then he would be done. That would be the net. That would be the nail that in his political coffin. But as long as people are okay with this anti-Muslim rhetoric and this anti-Mexican rhetoric, they're okay with that, apparently, because he's gotten himself in a position where he's nominated by the Republican Party. What does that say about the Republicans?
So, taking into consideration, as I mentioned earlier, you came of age in the 60s and 70s, and that was a time that's very much like what's going on with young people of color today around Black Lives Matter. Do you have any thoughts or words of wisdom that you would share with them?
I sort of have very mixed feelings about that because I know that, statistically, I suppose there are more Black lives being, destroyed by blacks themselves that that saddens me. And I know that the police brutality continues, but we have to do a little self-examination as well and see what's happening within the black mind. I mean, if Black Lives Matter, then blacks need to stop killing their own kind. And not only that, but selling drugs and other kinds of evils that seemingly are acceptable within the black community that we should be fighting against, also as being vigilant and concerned about what's happening within the black community, and not only those people that are being perceived as being, inimical to black interests, but we have to examine within our own communities what is going on in our communities that something's wrong with that picture as well. When we know that there are blacks killing blacks, and the violent rhetoric that is going on in terms of the rapping, that industry, the gangsterism, drugs, and other forms of violence it may not necessarily be as graphic as a police officer, killing a black person, engaging in certain behaviors that are being resulting in death. But there are a lot of things that are resulting in death in the black community that blacks are not holding themselves responsible. So if Black Lives Matter, then we need to. It should matter. It should matter to blacks too.
Are there any other points you would like to bring up in closing?
Well, just the mere fact that we have in this conversation, it's a hope. I still remain hopeful in terms of for my own community and being a member, obviously, of the black community, but also being, American Muslim. That somehow, this kind of dangerous rhetoric will subside, and that Muslims as well as all Americans can be safe and not be demonized and try to like you talked about the red peril. Well, there was this yellow peril at one point in time, and now it's the green peril, because oftentimes people perceive the Islamic world in terms of colors, green, and I think colors, be it blue states, red states, black against white, this color consciousness has to end, and in order to, it's all part of a scheme to demonize others. So that's, I think, at the core of our problems today. The color problem, because it's a false sense of humanity when you start categorizing people in those different kinds of categories. Whether or not I have brown eyes or blue eyes, or I got black skin or white skin, it shouldn't matter. We're all human beings.
Thank you for listening today, and please tune in for other episodes of this series as they are released by the Rhode Island Media Cooperative. You can follow along through our Facebook page or on Twitter via @RI Media Co-op.